Will they? Won't they? That's the question in Washington as the world's two biggest economies sit down to work out their differences and settle their open trade conflict. Since U.S. President Donald Trump took office, Beijing and Washington have taken turns slapping each other with ever higher punitive tariffs. The U.S. government argues that China is taking advantage of existing trade regulations, using a combination of state subsidies and industrial espionage to illegitimately gain a leg up on the competition. Case in point, Huawei. The U.S. recently accused the Chinese tech giant of violating international sanctions against Iran and stealing trade secrets, something the Chinese government vehemently denies.
It's been some time since the U.S. started to use its state power to smear and suppress certain Chinese enterprises in an attempt to throttle their legitimate operations. Their intentions are strongly political and manipulative. We solemnly urge the U.S. to stop ill-founded suppression of Huawei and other Chinese enterprises.
Experts are skeptical that both sides will find common ground this week. China is unlikely to give up its cavalier approach to foreign intellectual property anytime soon. And after Trump's recent loss in the U.S. governmental shutdown, he's likely to push for sweeping reform. But time is ticking. If no deal is reached, Trump has threatened to impose another $267 billion of tariffs on Chinese goods starting in March.
Let's take a closer look at these trade talks. I'm joined now by DW correspondent Zhou Zhanghan in Taipei and DW Frankfurt correspondent Paul Christian Britz. Now, Zhou, let's start with you. We've heard a bit about the economy in China slumping and the idea that that could play into the negotiations, even Trump saying as much. What does it look like there from your perspective? You've been talking with investors.
Well, for the investors in China or some of the entrepreneurs, they are really worried and not very optimistic because things look really bad right now in China. We heard from the investors that some of them, they cannot get the money from the local governments after they promised to get the money for the government construction project. And some entrepreneurs worry that the government will turn to public funds to fill the financial deficit. So coming back to the trade negotiation, right now it's really very important for the Chinese government to find a way to make a better deal without sacrificing China's own principles. And that's a very difficult task for them.
Now, Paul, so much talk about the slumping Chinese economy and the role it will play, but the U.S. companies haven't had it easy, have they?
No, they haven't, Steve. Even though Donald Trump likes to stress that the Chinese economy is slowing and sees that as a reason for Beijing to return to the table, the U.S. economy isn't doing great. One recent example from this week is machine maker Caterpillar. The U.S. machine maker is suffering in several ways. It has now posted its biggest earnings miss in 10 years, and it's exposed in two ways. One, because there's rising prices in steel and other materials from the tariffs. And the second one is it is exposed to the Chinese market. About 10% of its revenue comes from the Chinese market. So it's double exposed and suffering like other companies in the U.S. as well.
Now, so a big part of this whole dispute is over intellectual property and the allegation that China forces companies to turn over their intellectual property to do business in China. What can China do in this regard?
Well, actually, China is willing to do as much as they can. Actually, China's leader Xi Jinping, he promised last year in a public speech that China will try very hard to protect IP and do it as soon as possible. And just from the beginning of this year, China launched the IP protection court. But I think the essential question is that they don't know what the U.S. really wants. No matter how much they do, they worry that the U.S. just uses as an excuse to stop the Chinese economy and to stop the development of Chinese technology.
It's interesting. And so I have to ask you also, we've been talking a lot about Huawei. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin saying recently that the issue of Huawei can be separated from the trade issue. How does China see this?
Well, China definitely sees it very differently because people talk about the timing because, you know, like Meng Wanzhou's arrest is during China's leader Xi Jinping and Donald Trump's meeting in G20. And right now they have this announcement of indictment of Huawei CFO just right before the trade talk. Of course, people will say that it might be coincidental, but I think from China's point of view, no matter it's a coincidence or not, it's still like a very provocative act. So no matter how, they'll have to raise the issue on the trade negotiation table and make sure that Donald Trump will not make them lose face or look bad again.
So then a lot of moving parts as these trade negotiations begin today. We'll keep following them, of course. Zhou Zhanghan there for us in Taipei and Paul Christian Britz there for us in Frankfurt. Thank you both.